Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. India's foreign policy is at a major crossroads today. The international system, the South Asian neighborhood, and the global balance of power are all undergoing major transformations. And New Delhi today needs to take serious decisions on how to respond to these developments. Will India continue to play it safe and be cautious? Or will the line of active control standoff with China finally force India to align with the United States of America? If so, would strategic autonomy be a thing of the past? Where does our foreign policy go from here? To give us a big picture view of this predicament faced by India's foreign policy makers, I have with me Ambassador Shyam Saran. Shyam Saran, a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, is a former foreign secretary and has served as the Prime Minister's special envoy for nuclear affairs and climate change. He was also the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board of the Government of India. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, Ambassador Saran.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Ambassador, you wrote in the Indian Express in June 2019 that I quote, as US-India competition intensifies, India should refrain from taking sides. India should be successful in resisting demand to choose one side of the fence or the other, because the fence itself will be rickety and shifting. 14 months since you wrote this, a lot has happened, in particular, the standoff on the line of actual control with China. Do you think the situation on the ground has changed since you wrote this drastically? If so, have you changed your opinion about the importance of being on the fence?
So I have a fundamental problem with this idea that India is sort of always sitting on the fence. I don't think that's a accurate characterization of India's foreign policy, or what India's foreign policy should be. Because even at the time when we said we were a non-aligned country, it was not that India was a passive actor. In fact, if you look at the whole history post-Indian independence, and I would say almost right up to the 70s, India has always been a very, very active participant in international affairs, in regional affairs. So it has not looked upon its policy as, I don't want to get involved with the rest of the world. I will stay away from everyone and keep myself protected. I think that's a wrong way to look at India's foreign policy. What is really the characteristic of Indian foreign policy? And I see, by the way, a certain continuity in that policy over the last several decades. The way I describe it is that as a major power, and as a country which believes it is a major power and destined to become an even more powerful country,
Right.
India wants that on issues which are of vital interest to India, it should be able to take relatively autonomous decisions. That is, those decisions should not be taken in some other capital. They should be taken in Indian capital. So when we talk about, for example, non-alignment, or we are talking about strategic autonomy, somebody today says multi-alignment,
Right.
Issue-based coalitions, at the heart of all these various labels that we are using, I think the reality is precisely what I mentioned, that India wants to be certain that on issues which it determines, and that may change over a period of time, what we consider to be vital interest for India. But whatever we determine to be in our vital interest, on those issues, India should be able to take relatively autonomous decisions. And I believe this characteristic of Indian foreign policy has not changed over the last 7 decades or so. So as I said, I have a fundamental problem in looking at India as somehow always sitting on the fence. I don't think that is an accurate description of how India executes, formulates, and executes this foreign policy.
Sure. Let's come to the specific issue about the US-China competition. that was intensifying when you wrote this article in 2019. And in this particular context, you are making the argument that we should neither go towards the US side, nor should we go towards the Chinese side. My question is, has that assessment changed in the wake of what happened in Galwan in the middle of this year?
Well, it's not a either or situation. It's not as if either you are in an alliance or you are not in an alliance. There are shades of partnership in between those two ends of the spectrum. Don't forget that from 1960 to 1990, did we not have a very strong strategic partnership with the Soviet Union? It was very much, based on a certain strong convergence of interest, particularly with respect to the threat which both countries perceived as emanating from China. And that was the reason why we were very closely aligned, not allied, but certainly aligned. And I think we are today in a similar kind of a situation. But here, instead of the Soviet Union, we have the United States of America, where there is a strong convergence of interest, both countries, that Asia, which is very important to us, should not fall under the domination of a new hegemonic power. Because India would not like to accept that kind of an architecture in Asia. So to that extent, there has been, due to recent developments, in particular, greater aggressiveness, greater assertiveness that you are seeing on part of China. Not only on the borders with India, but you are seeing this in many other domains, particularly say South China Sea. So if you look at this changing situation, is there greater convergence of interest between India and the US than perhaps a year and a half back? I would say, yes, there is. But it's not as if, suddenly there is a dramatic sort of a departure from the past. After all, India-US relations have been becoming more and more, I think, strong in different domains for the last several years. In fact, since the end of the Cold War, what we have seen is progressively a greater convergence of interest between India and the United States of America. Is that getting strengthened? Yes, I would say it is getting strengthened. Is that a big departure from the past? No, it is not a big departure from the past. Is it already taken the character of an alliance? No, it has not yet taken the character of an alliance. What is difference in an alliance from an alignment? Alliance is where, as far as the leadership of the alliance is concerned, you have to follow the leader's interest, even though it may not be your interest. Right? In an alignment, you work together on areas of convergence, but there may be areas where there is not much of a convergence. And the example I give you, again, going back to the strategic partnership between India and the Soviet Union, there were areas of very strong convergence between the two sides. But take, for example, our attitude towards the non-proliferation treaty. The Soviet Union, like the United States of America, wanted India to become part of the non-proliferation treaty. We said, yes, we have convergent interests with you, but on this issue, we cannot follow your lead. So that's the difference, between an alliance and an alignment.
So, Amb.Shyam Saran, you are, how I understood you correctly, are you saying that India should perhaps strive towards an issue-based alignment with the United States of America, rather than going into a military alliance with the United States of America?
Well, what I'm saying is that there are strong convergences between India and the United States. So when we are talking, for example, about the Indo-Pacific, we are talking about maritime security. No doubt there are very strong convergence of interest between the two sides. But if you look at our Western flank, which is also very important to us, say the relationship with Iran or what is happening in Afghanistan, I do not see the same kind of alignment of interest with the United States as it is on our eastern flank.
On the question of Iran.
On
the question of Iran, you do not see the same.
Question of Iran, because Iran is a very important country to us. Don't forget that Iran is also today, thanks to our Western flank in a sense being being blocked by Pakistan. Our access to Afghanistan, our access to Central Asia, and even beyond, Iran has become very important in that context. So even though the United States of America, in its global view, may consider Iran as a rogue nation or as a threat to US interests, that is not how we see it. So there is, if we were an ally of the United States, despite having these reservations, we would still have to follow the US lead on Iran, but we cannot. So I think we should make this distinction that we have not yet come to a point where our interests, say by China, are threatened so much that we have no option but to, in fact, accept a subordinate alliance kind of a relationship where the US and where we willingly subordinate our interests to that of the United States. That, I think, is an important aspect that we should remember.
So just to get that right, so despite the setback that India seems to have faced in Galwan, India should not become a military ally of the United States. India should continue to maintain that strategic autonomy, as it were, and sort of selectively align with the United States on certain issues. Have I got that right?
Well, I think Galwan is a very serious development, a very negative development, but I don't think we should exaggerate it to the extent that we are seeing it as almost a threat to India's survival. No, I don't think we are anywhere near that. Yes, there is some territorial sort of incursion that we have to deal with. We have not even come to the end of our military as well as diplomatic efforts to try and see whether we can get back to status quo ante. I think we should give some room for those efforts to continue. And as I said, don't exaggerate the significance of Galwan by itself. I think the larger question is Galwan as a demonstration of China's enhanced power, asserting itself unilaterally. The message coming to us is you should recognize what your place today is in terms of the power equation between the two sides.
Right.
Right. So it is that larger context which is more important to me rather than the specific incident of Galwan.
Right. Amb.Shyam Saran, you use the phrase strategic autonomy, and this is an oft-used phrase in Indian foreign policy. How do you understand this concept, and what are its origins in the evolution of India's foreign policy, as it were?
So this is what I was trying to explain earlier, that, I do not see major departures in terms of the underpinning of India's foreign policy. And what is that underpinning? That underpinning is that India has always had a sense of itself as a major power, as a country which is destined to be a major actor in international affairs, not only, like people say, a rule taker, but also a rule maker.
Right.
One of the architects in shaping the newly emerging global order, rather than having to just accept what others have constructed around us. Now, it is in that sense that I say that India has always, and at different periods of time, it may have assessed its interests differently and perhaps pursued those interests in some different manner. But the essential goal of India has been that wherever I see my vital interests, wherever I see that the national interests of India are involved, on those occasions, on those issues, we should be in a position to take, as I said, relatively autonomous decision. They cannot be 100% autonomous. Why? because we are living in a multi-state kind of an environment. So,
Right.
I cannot, in an absolute sense, try to enforce my interests over those of the other. So there is always a certain amount of give and take.
Right.
But that is where, relatively speaking, we should be able to take more or less autonomous or independent decisions. So this is my concept of strategic autonomy. And what I have argued for some time now is that whether you give it a label of non-alignment, whether you give it a label of multi-alignment, whether you say strategic autonomy, or whether you say issue-based coalition, underpinning all this is that particular principle that I talked about, which is India in a position to take, as I said, relatively autonomous decisions on issues which are of vital interest?
Right. I mean, Ambassador, the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar recently made two interesting arguments in one statement. He said, non-alignment is an old concept today, but India will never be part of the alliance system. You basically did mention the latter part of the argument, which is India will not be part of the alliance system. To that extent, you seem to agree with what the Foreign Minister Jaishankar said. But on the first part,
well, as I said, I am not so much concerned about what label you are using. So if Mr. Jaishankar is saying non-alignment is no longer a appropriate phrase to use to describe India's foreign policy, okay, that's fine. But whether or not a alliance is precluded for all time to come is something that I would perhaps be a little careful about, because quite theoretically speaking, there could be an occasion where India's interests are threatened in a manner that they can be safeguarded only through having an alliance relationship. So I do not, preclude that forever, but I would certainly agree that placed as we are today, and given the kind of power which we are able to deploy today and hope to be able to deploy in the future, I would hope that we do not come to a point where we have to enter into a alliance relationship with whichever power. So
right.
We came fairly close to it, if you remember, in 1971 with the Soviet Union.
Right.
Because we were faced with a very, very difficult situation at that time.
Right.
So it was not alliance, but it was pretty close in a sense to an alliance.
Right.
Would that situation again arise in the future? It could. I cannot say that it would not. But certainly I would agree that at this point of time, despite Galwan having happened, I do not see the need for that kind of an alliance.
Ambassador, I understand the argument that you're making, but I think there seems to be a certain tension here, because Jaishankar is clearly ruling out an alliance system, which you also did. What he's not, what he's doing actually, on the other hand, is it's sort of soft pedaling or sort of de-stressing the importance of non-alignment, which could also be interpreted as, a soft pedaling the importance of strategic autonomy. Or am I understanding him? Ambassador Saran, if we look at the international system today, the liberal international order seems to have taken a, it sort of pushed to the back burner, as it were. This is a more realist world order today, as it were, realism, quote unquote. Norms and good behavior are on the wane, and the realpolitik and self-help seem to be on the ascendance. Now, in a world of this kind, how should India engage that sort of an international system?
So the first point I would like to make is that, the liberal international order was something that was for the West.
Right.
I do not think that many other countries would accept for the liberal international order for them. Why were we, for example, constantly finding ourselves, struggling with this international order? In many ways, the non-alignment movement itself was a reaction to this version of the liberal international order. Because it was based on an assumption of long-standing Western ascendancy, political, security, as well as financial and economic. So indeed. I think when we are talking about, how do we deal with this breakdown of the international, liberal order? My first point is that it was not necessarily a positive from the point of view of, those who did not belong to the Western system. Secondly, I think it is also important to understand today that those who are wrecking the international liberal order are precisely those who were the chief upholders of that order.
That's right.
Right?
That's
so,
right.
Who is undermining that order? Not India, not even China in that sense, because China says, I want this order to continue because I have benefited so much.
Right.
Who is dissatisfied with the international liberal order? It is the United States of America. It is the countries of Western Europe who find themselves unable to compete with the newly emerging powers, newly emerging forces, of which China certainly is one of the most important, but China is not the sole representative of those new forces. So I think we should be a little careful in judging where India must place itself. I don't think that we should somehow assume that we have a sort of a natural interest in upholding this order. Some aspects of that order certainly has been helpful to India, but there are other aspects of that order that we would want to see changed. So there are, for example, existing regimes. Take the United Nations itself. After all, we are dissatisfied because we do not have a position in the UN system which reflects what we regard as our major power status, right?
Sure.
If we look at the global trading system, we have major difficulties and have had these difficulties for quite some time. When we are looking at new regimes like climate change, like the space order, or we are looking at cyberspace, we want to be able to play a role in shaping those orders. Not be, as I said, merely a rule taker. We would like to be in a position to be a rule maker. So I think there is a certain nuance in the manner in which we look at the international liberal order, what it really means for us, and more important is that whatever order is going to replace it,
right?
Whatever is emerging as the new architecture, both regionally as well as internationally, India should be able to find diplomatic space for itself. And I believe that in the kind of transition which is taking place, the kind of flux which is taking place, this is also opening up opportunities for India to expand its diplomatic space, even though there are also major risks that we are confronting.
So I understand. I think but there seems to be a certain dilemma here. The dilemma is that clearly the receding world order, if I may put it that way, was led by the United States and the West. But today there's an emergence of a world order which is the gravity which is shifting to the Asian continent, with China perhaps going to be the key architect of that world order. Which one is preferable as far as India is concerned? And to my mind, the Western US-led order is more preferable to a China-led order. Or do you look at it differently?
Well, one is what is preference, and one is what is the likelihood of what will. Okay. Now, I have also made the point that, as far as the United States is concerned, it has woken up to the threat which China represents much too late. That in fact, it was complicit in the emergence of China as a trade power.
Absolutely.
Right? So now it has woken up and says, this far and no further. But it is actually, what I say is, trying to shut the door after the horse has bolted, in a sense.
Right.
Secondly, if you look at it from the Chinese point of view, I think the Chinese are making a mistake in thinking that they are already at the top of the pipe, that they are already, a superpower. So, to my mind, China has declared victory too early. And which is the reason why today you are seeing a huge pushback also to China.
That's right.
It's not just COVID-19 related. There is a general, anxiety about what kind of great power China is likely to be. So if you look at its actions in the South China Sea, if you see the manner in which the BRI that you mentioned earlier, how that is being rolled out, if you are looking at what's happening on the border with India, you see its penetration in the periphery of India. If you take all these things together, then you can also understand why the rest of the world, not only in Asia, but in the rest of the world, there is a growing anxiety about China as a great power. So this is why I'm saying that China has perhaps declared victory too early, and which is the reason why we see a certain flux, a certain kind of a very disturbed situation internationally. And what I also foresee is that the confrontation between China and the United States is going to continue because it is structural now in character. But I do not see in the foreseeable future one or the other being able to prevail over the other. And therefore there will be a certain flux. But I also foresee that countries like India, other emerging powers, particularly powers which in their own regions are in fact quite prominent, quite powerful, there could be a trend towards greater multipolarity, if you wish to call it. But you are probably not going to see the kind of bipolar situation that we had during the Cold War. I for one do not see that happen.
Right. Basar, I think in my opinion, the biggest decision that India has to make at this point of time is how to respond to the China challenge, as it were, and not just the China challenge in the region, but also the China-led strategic partnerships in the region. And day by day, the intensity and the extent of those partnerships are increasing. How should India deal with that threat, as it were?
So, it's a fairly simple answer to that question. The only way you can deal with this challenge is one, through internal balancing, and the second is through external balancing. I would certainly prefer the first, that is internal balancing.
Right.
Because it is only if India is able to expand its economic, technological, and military power and shrink the power gap with China, that it would be better placed to meet the China challenge. Why? Because if you look at potential competitors to China, India is perhaps the only country which, in terms of its size, in terms of its population, in terms of its economic potential, in terms of its sense of itself as a great civilizational entity in the same manner that China is. India is perhaps the only country which, to me, has the potential not only to shrink this gap and catch up with China, but even to in a sense, surpass China. So internal balancing is my preference. Now, if that takes time, or if that does not happen fast enough, then yes, of course, external balancing will be very important. And the good news here is, as I said, there is a pushback to China's assertion of power. Therefore, it is possible for you to look at countervailing coalitions of countries which are as concerned as you are about this predilection on the part of China to be a selfish power, to try and accumulate power at the expense of others. So a combination of internal balancing with external balancing is in fact the way to go forward. So when we are talking about, say, the Indo-Pacific strategy, or we are talking about, is there going to be a crystallization of the Quad, for example, these are part of external balancing. But even that external balancing, will be perhaps more efficacious if India were able to, put its heads down and really try to bring about economic reforms, also in order to make India once again one of the fastest growing large economies in the world. That will lead to a very major significant expansion in our diplomatic space.
Right. Ambassador,
between 2000 and 2007, if you recall, during that time we were growing at the rate of something like 8 to 9% per annum. India was being looked upon as the next China. That was the period where we were able to create the situation around us in terms of better relations with our neighbors. We were able to create a very strong positive relationship with the United States, which made the Indo-US nuclear deal possible. Even with China, we were able to, in 2005, get them to issue a map showing Sikkim as a part of India for the first time. We were able in 2005 to be able to, negotiate the political parameters and guiding principles for resolving the border issue, which was perhaps the most positive document which we were able to negotiate for a long time. This was the period when the special representatives mechanism was set up between the two countries to try and resolve quickly the border issue. So if you look at that period, that gives you a sense of what is possible if you are able to once again shrink that power gap with China. It was not that we were in the same league as China, but while the Chinese economy was slowing down, our economic growth rate was going down. This is the situation which came to a halt and reversed after the global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008. And we have not been able to recapture that positive phase since then.
That's an interesting distinction you made between internal balancing and external balancing. Now, let's unpack the external balancing a little more. I think to a great extent, when we talk about external balancing, we are talking about the United States of America. Now, a lot of people seem to argue that United States is perhaps, to some extent, India's answer to the China challenge, as it were. Is that really the case? I mean, how far? Because the relationship with the United States is a complicated question, as it were.
So I think what we should be looking at is what are some of the realistic possibilities that are available to. So even when we are looking at, for example, the Indo-Pacific strategy, it is not just anchored in our security relationship with the United States. I consider it to be very important that we have also in the last few years developed very strong security relationship with Japan, very strong security relationship with Australia. We are, enhancing and expanding our security relationship with countries of ASEAN, particularly Singapore or Indonesia, which is going to be, to my mind, one of the major players in the future. So I don't think we should be looking at a one silver bullet which is going to resolve all our problems. Certainly, the United States of America will be an integral component of any countervailing position that I mentioned. But it is not the only, sort of participant or partner when we are looking at that countervailing position. Second important point is, especially if you look at a slightly longer term perspective. So if there is going to be, for the foreseeable future, a sharpening contradiction between the US and China, okay? US is not able to prevail over China. China is not able to prevail over the United States of America. Now, it is conceivable that over a period of time, one or the other is able to prevail. That's a possibility. I mean, there may be a rejuvenation of the United States as a great power, which has happened in the past. You recall what happened after the Vietnam War. So I don't think we should write off the United States, but it is likely that there will be a prolonged confrontation between the US and China until one is able to prevail over the other. But there is also a possibility that they will come to some kind of an accommodation with each other if they are not able to prevail over one. After all, there was a certain kind of accommodation in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Each had a certain sphere of influence which either side, in fact, respected. So when it was Eastern Europe, the United States of America may make a lot of noise, but did not really interfere there. Similarly, the Soviet Union would not do so with regard to, what are the core interests or vital interests of the United States and Western power. Now, is that a conceivable future? It could be that the United States of America and China decide that rather than be locked into this perennial and very expensive confrontation, why don't we come to some kind of accommodation with some understanding over spheres of influence? Now, what would be the sphere of influence which China would want? It is Asia. Now, where is it that we perceive the threat from China? It is in Asia. So would we like the United States of influence or not? So even though that is unlikely to happen in the near future, but it is a possibility that you should not exclude. You should have it in your mind that this could happen in the future. And therefore, where you position yourself in this changing geopolitical transition should take into account that possibility as well.
Interesting. In other words, India should not end up becoming a sacrificial lamb in the great power competition, as it were.
Right. Because the US, in pursuit of its global aims, may not be particularly mindful of India's interests.
Interesting. Ambassador, there's a lot of talk today in India about the need to decouple from China, especially in the wake of the LSE standoff. Now, I understand this is a lot of heartwarming talk, but realistically speaking, how is it even possible? Can India afford to decouple itself from China economically speaking?
Well, I think we have the same dilemma which the United States is facing. That in today's globalized kind of economy, where there are extended supply chains, even if you say I will not buy this Chinese product, even if you are buying, say, a German product, or you are buying a Japanese product, there are so many components which are being made in China. So how are you going to treat that? So I think we have to be a little careful that we don't end up by hurting ourselves more than we hurt China through the actions which we are taking.
That's right.
We need to have a selective, a nuanced kind of a response to this. I am not saying that there will not be areas where it is better for you to not have to depend upon supplies only from China. A diversification of sources of supply has always made sense and will continue to make sense. And perhaps if this is pushing us in that direction, I would say so much for the better. For example, if you look at the digital media, it much dominates. For example, it is very much influenced by, or the investment is coming from Alibaba. So we should be careful that a domain of the future, which is going to be so important, that is the digital domain, you should not allow, not only China, but not allow any power to have such overwhelming, domination. So we can be selective in terms of trying to reduce our dependence upon China, but I think we should also be mindful that in this kind of very globalized, integrated kind of market, it may not be possible for us to, decouple, to a very significant extent. I think that is simply not realistic.
Put differently, it is not easy to wish away China's economic or political influence in the region. Now,
it is the largest trading power in the world. It's the second
Absolutely.
largest economy in the world. So how do you completely decouple from it?
In that context, and looking back at the, say, when BRI was still in the process of proposal stage, CPEC was still in the proposal stage, and China was inviting India, left, right, and center to join those initiatives. Looking back at BRI and CPEC, do you today think that it was a good thing or a bad thing that India rejected being part of either of these two initiatives?
So I would make a distinction between CPEC and BRI. CPEC is problematical because the projects are going through territory which is claimed by India as its own.
Right.
Now, for reasons of territorial integrity, of sovereignty, I cannot see how India would say, let's forget about it or put it aside and let's get on with cooperation. That is not something that I would, in fact, propose that we should.
Right.
Secondly, even if you said you were ready to join CPEC, there is no indication that Pakistan would give you any role in respect of CPEC. So, how are we making an assumption that somehow, Pakistan would be ready to accept that India should be part of CPEC? So that's a separate issue. With regard to BRI as a Chinese, initiative, I make a distinction between BRI and, say, for example, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, where you are the second largest shareholder. Take the BRICS Development Bank. Not only are you a second largest shareholder, but one Indian was, in fact, until recently heading that institution. Why the difference in our position with respect to these two, both Chinese-led initiatives? Because in one of them, the banks, we had a major role to play in the whole design of the institution. In what are the norms it would follow, what would be its lending policy, what would be its personnel policy. So we were a stakeholder right from the beginning. So we had no problem in becoming part and parcel of what was truly a multilateral institution.
That's right.
Now, in contrast to that, the BRI is not a multilateral institution. It is a Chinese-led, Chinese-financed, Chinese-designed project. And we are being asked, please sign on the dotted line. Why should we? I don't know what is the financing mechanism that you have. I do not know what is the manner in which these loans are going to be structured. What is the relationship that you have with the partner country? Because it is actually a string of bilateral partnerships between China and the partner country. It is not multilateral in that sense. So I think we should make a distinction between BRI and a truly multilateral project. So I believe that India's caution on BRI has been well-founded. And in fact, since the time that we showed our reluctance to join, you see a lot of developments taking place which seem to bear out some of the reservations that we have had. In terms of, for example, the financial viability of some of the projects, or whether or not the interests of the partner country have actually been taken into account. Having said that, there may be specific areas where even if we are not part of the BRI, we can certainly utilize the platforms which are being created through the BRI also to advance our economic interests. So I have pointed out that, for example, when we are talking about Chabahar Port, we are talking about the north-south link from Chabahar into Central Asia. The Chinese are building a Eurasian corridor. Now, if there is a certain mutual interest in that Eurasian corridor linking up with this North-South corridor, why should we say no merely because it is being done under BRI? So I don't think there is an ideological problem here.
We should have a nuanced approach.
Wherever it is possible for us in specific areas to work together, yes, we could have. If, for example, China says that, in building a port in Indonesia, let us cooperate. Okay, if it makes sense for us, it is economically viable, and it also is something on the interest of Indonesia, should we consider it? Yes, I would say consider it. Of course, in the current political context between the two countries, we may not be able to look at that. But I mean, in theoretical terms, I do not see a problem. But I do believe that our caution with respect to CPEC, our caution with respect to BRI, in fact, are very well founded.
Ambassador, here is my last question. That's really a conceptual one in many ways. You wrote in the Hindu newspaper in June this year that it is sad to see, and I quote, it is sad to see that now foreign policy too has fallen victim to the very narrow and cynical jostling in domestic politics. This can be very damaging to intelligent and careful foreign policy making, unquote. Could you explain what you mean by this rather strong statement that you made in that article?
Oh, well, I mean, isn't it easy to see how, our policy towards, for example, Pakistan is now almost completely determined by domestic political calculations. If you ask me as a professional, does it make sense for India to have a live Western flank and now a live Northern flank? It doesn't. Okay. In terms of our relationship with Bangladesh, which in fact we have slogged for several years to try and bring it to a level where we have a good understanding. Now, if your home minister says, there are termites who are coming from across the border, should you be surprised that there is a very negative sort of a perception of India now in that country? So I think it is very important to keep, domestic political calculations as far as possible separate from what are in the national interest of the country. National interest of the country cannot be made a political football domestic. And I think we are losing out precisely because of our temptation to try and score domestic political points by bringing in foreign policy, or looking at, say, what may have happened in our relationship with country X or country Y as a means of scoring points against some opposition party. One of the great strengths of India has been that whatever may be the political differences and competitiveness domestically, there has been a broad national consensus on foreign policy. And I think that has been a very important asset which India has. We should not try and erode that asset in this kind of a manner, yielding to the temptation of, using a foreign policy issue for domestic political purposes. I know that sometimes, especially in dealing with neighbors, it is sometimes not very easy to draw a line between domestic politics and foreign policy. You take, for example, Sri Lanka and the Tamil issue. Sometimes, it becomes difficult to unravel that. But the effort has to be made, because it is very important that India's national interests do not get undermined because of this, playing of a kind of a political game with foreign policy. I don't think that is very good for India. That is what I meant. That as a professional, I would not want to see that in trying to conduct India's foreign relations, I have to constantly be looking back at what the domestic political situation and what the political masters want in terms of the domestic politics. No, I don't think that's a good idea.
But that's an interesting point. You're basically saying that there was a certain amount of enlightened consensus in the
Yes.
Indian polity
Yes.
among the political class as far as foreign policy was concerned. So what sort of made it possible before, say, 2014 to have that kind of a consensus? Was it the character of the political class? Was it a consensus, a sort of understanding among various political parties? What made it possible, say, when you were Foreign Secretary? What explained the fact that there was even a consensus possible at that point of time?
Well, this was a certain tradition which was put in place right since the early days of our independence. Just as we had a political consensus over the Constitution of India, just as we had a political consensus about secularism.
That's right. That's right.
Just as we had a consensus about, democracy as being a great asset for a multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious country like India. It was not only just foreign policy, but there was a broad political consensus. And I would say not only political consensus politically amongst parties, but also a national political consensus.
That's right.
That is, across the board, there was a certain acceptance that democracy is worth preserving in India, that secularism is something which is important for India. I think what has started happening is that national consensus has also started fraying, but who is responsible for that? The responsibility is really of the political class. I cannot get away from that fact. That the temptation has always been that, first let's get political power, then we will see what we need to do about other things. It doesn't work that way.
That's right.
So, if we want to safeguard India's national interests, not only safeguard, but if we want to promote India's national interests, it is very important that we should restore political consensus, irrespective of whatever ideologies or persuasions which various parties wish to follow. And in fact, the political parties must work together to, in fact, strengthen the national consensus within the country, because that is what gives power to diplomats. That what they are representing is not the interest of one or the other party; they are representing the interest of India. So if I was in the foreign service for so many years, never once did I have a feeling that I was not representing India's interest, that it was a Congress interest that I was representing, or when Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was Prime Minister, that it was Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's interests that were being represented. No. So I think it is very important that national consensus, the value of which is intangible in a sense, yes, but that is very, very valuable in terms of advancing the country's interests.
Right.
And this temptation that if you do not conform to what I say India's interests are, therefore you are somehow or the other undermining the nation. That can be very, very damaging to my.
Spoken like a true statesman, Amb.Shyam Saran. It was wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.